CNBC TV 18 Weekender.
We're talking about the US, and one of the big things that the US market or Indian companies and US companies are dealing with is this whole pricing pressure. Before I get to pricing pressure, there's also a pricing probe which is taking place in the US by the Department of Justice. Do you think that the dynamics are changing for good when it comes to pricing in the US?
Well, I think, very clearly, first of all, the FDA has accelerated approval of new products. So that is increasing the competitive intensity. So automatically, it's very hard to have a product where you're alone or you're one of two. And with the competitive intensity increasing, it's extremely hard to raise prices. So the environment is definitely changing, and that is ensuring that companies are not in a position to take up prices anymore.
Okay. How serious do you think this Department of Justice probe is? I mean, are you from an industry perspective? I know Glenmark is not a part of it.
I have absolutely no comment on what's going on, because it's very hard to predict how things will play out from here.
Okay, fair enough. That point is taken, and you haven't received a subpoena either. The other part of pricing issues is that there's vendor consolidation which is taking place in the US as well. So say in FY18, how much do you expect your portfolio to be impacted, say, by pricing pressure itself?
Well, I think every year we anticipate almost 10% hit coming out of pricing. So there is pricing pressure, and so 10% is what we stand to lose on an annual basis, just out of pricing.
And then how do you deal with it?
Our growth comes primarily from launch of new products and gaining market share in our existing products. I mean, that's the only way to deal with it. And given that our base is much smaller, it's much easier for us to keep growing, at least for the next 2 or 3 years, just by launching new products, right, and gaining that kind of traction.
Okay, so launching, but then would that also mean focusing a lot more on, say, the branded segment vis-a-vis, say, the other segments, the generic segment in the US, just to get more pricing power?
I think to get more pricing power, what we're doing is we have this rollout of various complex generics over the next 3 years, right? Like we talked about generic Abraxane, generic Novaring, generic Suboxone. So that all these, right, will get a much larger products which we've in-licensed, as well as our internal pipeline. So all this will actually help us in terms of, in terms of the growth and dealing with some of the price erosions that we are witnessing on the base portfolio.
Okay, well, that's on the US markets. What about India? Because India, you have a really good presence, especially in dermatology. You have market share of around 2.6% in the Indian markets. Are there too many headwinds now with NLEM and, say, FDC, and maybe a little uncertainty on regulation?
Well, we feel pretty good about our India presence and India growth prospects. While you do have, the NLEM, but I guess most governments today, right, you go to any country, you've got some form of price control, except the US, right? So we're pretty used to having price control in some shape or form in most of the markets that we operate in. Except India, given the number of products already on the market and the competitive intensity, it's a little tough putting so many products under price control. So that challenge is always there. FDC is basically regularizing products within the Indian industry, right? And making sure we are compliant or at par with the global standards. So I think, that's a step which the government is taking, which I think, could benefit in the long run for India's image as a whole in the long run.
But how much of your portfolio, say, is impacted by NLEM and FTC?
So it's extremely small for us. Both NLEM, we have maybe about 20-30% of our portfolio which is under potential price control, but FDC is very, very small for us.
Okay, so say a sustainable run rate in the Indian markets would be what, according to you?
So currently, we are growing at about, I would say, about 15 to 18%, and I think going forward, we'll clearly be able to sustain a 15% growth coming out of India.
Okay, well, that's on the Indian markets, but one little bit of a pain point has been what's happening with Venezuela. You have, I think, around 30 to 50 million within that range in terms of funds which need to be repatriated. How difficult do you think it's going to be? What would we see that in FY18?
Well, our hope, clearly, we have about 30 million sitting in the bank in Venezuela, right? And we are hoping that the government will play a much more active role. There is efforts going on by the Indian government to try and do some swaps so that we can recover a lot of the Indian companies who have money stuck in Venezuela can recover those monies. So we are hopeful that that will happen, and that should happen pretty quickly is what our hope is.
Okay. Are you maybe reducing your business in Venezuela? How do you stand in terms of a position there?
So we've discontinued our business in Venezuela. So we don't sell anything in Venezuela anymore. We still have our registrations and everything there, purely because of the business environment right now.
Okay. So if, say, the business environment improves at some point, would you possibly restart your business in the same amount of momentum that you were doing?
Well, clearly there's a shake-up of confidence, right,
Yeah.
because of what the country has gone through. And I don't see that happening, at least for the next few years, in terms of potentially getting back into Venezuela.
What about the European markets then? Because that was down around 16% in the previous quarter. What is your strategy when it comes to Europe? Because we haven't seen a lot of Indian companies be too aggressive in Europe. So are you going to grow your portfolio there? How is it going to work?
I think Europe, we expect a great growth in the next 2-3 years. Obviously, the next year is driven by the generic Seretide or generic Advair launch, right, for which we license from Ceylon. On the back of that, we have several other potential in licensing of some major products which will drive growth in Europe over the next 3 to 5 years. So I think Europe will be a growth driver for the company over the next 3 to 5 years.
CNBC TV 18 Weekender.